Well, hello and welcome to another video by Financial Learning. On today's video, I want to talk about CleanSpark Inc.'s calendar year 2025 forecast. As you may know, Bitcoin price has been moving around quite a bit the past couple of days. There's been a lot of decoupling from the overall market, and even with gold, we saw some different price movement with Bitcoin. So this has a lot of crypto investors very bullish as to where Bitcoin price trajectory could be. So I've taken a look at one of the modeling. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but first, I want to also talk about CleanSpark and what they've been sharing with us investors over the past couple of weeks. They did share that Coinbase line of credit increase up to 200 million, and then we did hear from Zach as to what they plan on doing in terms of operations. They do plan on selling some of their mined Bitcoin in order to cover operations, and then looking to either invest in the company or continue building that HODL amount, that treasury amount for the next couple of months at least. We do know they also plan to hit that 50 exahash by the end of June, so we're all looking forward to those monthly updates. And then finally, just want to mention that the company has stated multiple times that there is no short-term outlook in terms of using one of those at the market offerings. And that's because if you look at book value, they're really trading pretty much almost at a 1.0 ratio in terms of that price to book value. So, with all that being said, I believe that CleanSpark wants to see that share price valuation jump up to probably price to book ratio between a 2 or 3 before they really consider tapping into that at the market offering. Again, this is just my speculation. Looking at that, that would be about a 2 to 3x in terms of that market cap, really, compared to what they have in terms of book value on their assets minus liabilities. So I like to talk about some of the other outlook items. So let's jump straight into that. All right, so for today's video, we're going to be looking at that Bitcoin price model, and I'll share exactly which model I'm using and who I actually got this from. Also, we're going to look at CleanSpark's current book value as well as that price to book ratio. And then we're going to look at that monthly book value projection. And then finally, a forecast modeling of their share price going all the way out to the end of calendar year 2025. And at the very end, I'm going to leave you with some of my closing thoughts. So I hope you stick around to hear that as well. But let's go ahead and jump straight into this first item. All right, and in terms of that Bitcoin price modeling, I'm going to be using the Bitcoin power law. And this graph was provided by Giovanni 350841111. And you can look him up on x.com if you'd like to get some more of his take on the Bitcoin price modeling. But again, that is the type of model I'll be using. And I did use ChatGPT and other AI tools in order to help me calculate some of these numbers. But I did go ahead and do some of my own trust but validation numbers just to ensure that I'm getting the right information from the AI. All right, so you may still be asking yourself, what in the world is this Bitcoin power law modeling? And I went ahead and got the top 3 key items that you need to understand about this modeling. So the first thing is going to be the logarithmic growth model. So this Bitcoin power law suggests that Bitcoin's price follows a logarithmic growth curve over time, increasing at a decreasing rate, but within a predictable band. And we'll talk a little bit about those bands when we start talking about the book value for CleanSpark moving forward, as well as some of the share price forecast modeling. The second item, time-based price floor. It establishes a lower bound price floor that rises consistently over time, implying that Bitcoin becomes more valuable the longer it survives. So let's stop right there. So as you know, Bitcoin does have a capped amount, and we do know that in terms of the halving cycles, it becomes more and more difficult to mine the Bitcoin. It takes immense amount of power in order to mine the same amount of Bitcoin after these halving cycles. With that being said, it's really important when you're looking at this to understand that as the demand for Bitcoin increases, the overall quantity for Bitcoin isn't changing. So the more demand we have, the higher the valuation is going to be, the more valuable it's going to be. If you're a collector and the item you have has a specific type of value, and you have a significant amount of collectors that also want that same item, but it's a limited supply item. It ends up increasing value rather substantially. And that is the same type of thing we see here with Bitcoin pricing. There's, of course, a ton of other research in terms of why Bitcoin pricing continues to appreciate over time. I can't go into all of that. I don't want this to turn into a multiple hour long video, and I'm sure you don't either. So, the third item, the deviation cycles. While short term price action can deviate significantly above or below the curve, so if you see some bullish price action on Bitcoin, or maybe even some bearish price action on Bitcoin, the long term trends tend to revert to within this hour law line. So, you've heard of bull cycles and bear cycles. So, during some of those cycle periods, the price of Bitcoin may drop out or drop above or push above, I should say, these specific power law bands. But over time, you will see that Bitcoin does tend to remain within these bands. So that's why I decided to go ahead and use this in terms of forecasting the Bitcoin price modeling. And I will give you the lower, mid, and upper potential here for Bitcoin pricing. And we'll talk about that on a future slide. And here it is. Here's that Bitcoin price modeling. And again, I went ahead and used AI to generate these. And this is really off of that graphic that I just got done showing you. So based off of that, month to month, you can see on the lower band side of things, Bitcoin could be anywhere from 85 in April all the way up to 101,000 in December. And just like they said, even though it could follow this lower band, there's still going to be times where we'll deviate from that on the upper and lower side, when you're talking about the bearish movement and the bullish movement. So keep that in mind. If Bitcoin price was to drop below that 85,000, that could just be a temporary movement. And according to this modeling, it should regain that price and fall back within this band. And then you can see the median, the middle of this band, sitting where anywhere from $91,500 here in April, and then pushing all the way up to 121,000 by the end of December. And then the upper band. I like this upper band. It has Bitcoin around 105,000 in the month of April and going up to 145,000 by the end of December. And again, just like we talked about in the lower band, there's potential for pricing to jump on a bullish type run scenario, and that could last for a few weeks or even a few months. And then it could also retrace back down, and it could actually drop below this specific upper band trajectory just based off of some bearish movement. So keep that in mind. This is by no means black and white, but it does provide us some form of bounds, if you will, on where Bitcoin pricing could be. So I did use this specific model in order to figure out some of the projections on book value as well as on share price value. So let's move over into some of CleanSpark's specifics. All right, and moving into some of CleanSpark's numbers here, this is how I'm calculating their current book value. I'm taking their latest quarterly earnings statement as well as the treasury review. We get that treasury review every single month when they provide the monthly mining numbers. We get an understanding of what that current HODL amount is. So let's talk about the HODL amount first. At the end of March, the HODL amount was totaling 11,869 Bitcoin. So that's important because each month, as CleanSpark continues to mine more Bitcoin, they will be selling a portion of Bitcoin to cover operations, and then potentially they can continue hodling the rest of that. So we'll look at that in just a minute. I did go ahead and extrapolate some of that and took some assumptions in mind. But before we move on to that, let's look at the quarterly earnings statement. So a few things I've highlighted here. The first is going to be the Bitcoin valuation, and this would be, again, at the end of December 2024. Bitcoin had a total value then of 929 million. And when I say total value, I'm talking about the price of Bitcoin times CleanSpark's HODL at that point in time. It's important because we do need to remove this value when we're looking at what I would consider to be fixed asset amounts and the liability amounts. Of course, the assets will be changing over time, just like liabilities will. But as an investor, we don't have that information, so I can't use that in my modeling information. So looking at that total asset amount, it is at $2.779 billion. So subtracting the Bitcoin value and also subtracting that total liability down there at $757 million, you're going to get a total book value for CleanSpark minus the Bitcoin value. And we'll be adding that Bitcoin value back in order to understand that total book value. Let's get into some of those calculations on this next slide. All right, taking a look at the book value. This is also going to be the price to book ratio, and then some of the assumptions that I had to take in order to make this model as easy as possible. So jumping straight in, the non-Bitcoin book value, this would be the total assets minus the Bitcoin value minus the liabilities. It came in at $1,092,000,000. And you can see here, I have it at 1,092 million because we're using million units throughout the rest of these calculations. And then I just put a note here that we're going to be assuming this as a constant based on this latest 10Q. So again, once we get the new earnings, it should be out sometime in May, we'll be able to reassess the book value at that time. But moving down to the second item. So March 31st Bitcoin holding value. I already mentioned that at 11,869. Looking at the current price of Bitcoin sitting around $93,200, that's what I used in order to figure out the current book value. I need to understand the current Bitcoin value. So that's what I have here. And then moving down to the third item, this is going to be how you do that total book value. It's going to be the non-Bitcoin book value, which is that 1,092,000,000 plus the Bitcoin holdings value. So when you add those two numbers together, you actually get a total book value at 2,198,000,000, or as I said, 2,198 million. Looking at book value per share, we're going to take the total book value, which we just calculated, divided by the total number of outstanding shares. And this was also shared on that earnings report. So we're going to use this number. And again, the executives at CleanSpark have stated that there is no short-term plan to do any additional the market offerings. So the dilution factor should not be weighing in, at least for the first half of the year, and maybe even longer, depending on how CleanSpark's book valuation continues to change over time. So looking at all that, book value per share, $7.82. And then the price to book ratio. In order to calculate that, you have to take the share price, and this is the current day share price as of market close was $8.87 divided by total book value per share. And you're able to get that ratio. It comes in at 1.13. I'm going to be using 1.13 for the remainder of the modeling. So that's one of these fixed assumptions. The other one, of course, I already mentioned is the non-Bitcoin book value. That is also going to be a fixed amount. Moving down into the other assumptions, profit margin at 35%. Looking over some of CleanSpark's latest mining information and looking at global hash rate, I found that CleanSpark should be somewhere in the ballpark of 33 to 35% profit margin. So we're going to use 35% here on out, and that is going to be a fixed profit margin percentage. And I mentioned here, I'm keeping this profit margin at 35% because of energy cost scaling with the global hash rate demand slash growth following this Bitcoin price curve. That may have been a mouthful, but just to dial it back a little bit, what I'm saying here is as the price of Bitcoin increases, there's going to be more and more miners that want to be able to take advantage of those higher prices. I should say they're going to be back in profits again. So I do think that as Bitcoin price continues to increase, we will see global hash rate increases. More machines will be turned on, even if they're less efficient. We'll see more hashing just because they're still able to run those older, less efficient machines and generate a form of profit. Now, of course, they're going to be limited by their overall infrastructure. There's only so many gigawatts or megawatts that these companies are going to be able to produce and put out in order to be able to sustain their Bitcoin miners. But again, all of that could be changing. It's a very dynamic amount. So I would assume that the hash rate globally would be scaling with price. And then also CleanSpark would need to continue to scale up operations in order to maintain their current market share. That price to book ratio, I already mentioned, it's staying at 1.13. Also, the mining numbers. I'm using 650 Bitcoin mined per month. I'm going to be using this as a fixed amount. I'm saying fixed because I do believe as global hash continues to rise, CleanSpark will be able to continue adding either additional miners or swapping out for more efficient miners in order to be able to mitigate some of that global hash rate increase in order to maintain that market share. So I'm just going to put them at a steady state of 650 Bitcoin monthly mined. And then based on that profit percentage, you can see I have them selling of that 650, 423 Bitcoin each month. And then they're able to hodl an additional 227 Bitcoin per month. And that 227 is going to be important because that is what we're using to show that book value growth over time. And speaking of growth over time, let's take a look at some of these book value calculations. Again, I'm using this Bitcoin monthly price model I have on the right-hand side, but using all of those other calculations and assumptions we just went over, here is a good look at what CleanSpark's book value could look like for the rest of the calendar year. So again, at the lowest end of this Bitcoin price band, sitting at $85,000 per Bitcoin in the month of April, has that valuation coming in at $7.55. I don't want to go over all of these numbers. It's here for your consumption, if you will. But definitely go ahead and take a look. Pause the video if you like. Take a screenshot. Do what you will. Again, this is just my assumptions based on some of those calculations that I did provide. And then before we move on, let's take a look at December. So end of calendar year, even if we're on the lower band of the Bitcoin pricing model, still puts us at $8.89 for the month of December. Now, the pricing does continue to increase over time as CleanSpark continues to add to that treasury hodl, and you can see that the price of Bitcoin is slowly increasing. So overall, treasury is gaining value, and then the treasury itself is growing in size. And just to talk about the uppermost side of this model, again, at $145,000 per Bitcoin by the end of the year, CleanSpark could have a book value sitting at $11.07. All right, and looking at the projected share price, I'm sure a lot of you are on here to see these specific numbers. And again, I have it on all these slides. This is not financial advice. These are just some of the calculations I came up with based on some of the assumptions I'm using. But you can see here the share price Bitcoin was sitting at 85,000 in the month of April, should be around $8.53. And remember, the difference in these is you have to take that book value times the price to book ratio amount, and that was at 1.13. So really, if you take that last table and you multiply by 1.13, you're going to get these specific prices. But moving across, you can see the upper band in April, if we had 105,000, it would be around $9.50. The funny thing is, if you look at Bitcoin pricing, we have been pushing into the $9 range here for CleanSpark. And again, not seeing much short interest movement, not seeing any dilution, as CleanSpark's already stated that that is not the case here. So it's just interesting that the pricing is kind of bouncing around here. Again, in my closing remarks, I'm going to talk about some of the things that could kind of push the price to book ratio numbers as well as the book value to kind of change. And then, as I already mentioned, with this modeling, you will have some bullish outcome and some bearish outcome that will move various Bitcoin pricing outside of these bands. So just keep that in mind when we're taking a look at all of these. And then looking at December, at the lower band amount, potential share price could be at $10.05. And then upper pricing could be at $12.51. Again, that's at $145,000 per Bitcoin. Let me leave you with just a couple final thoughts. All right, and what other factors could potentially change up this entire modeling structure in terms of the book value and the price to book? I have a couple of items here. So first thing is going to be macro events. We've seen a ton of these already this calendar year with President Trump, the tariff war that's going on with China and other countries. And then we've seen a lot of interesting changes that we have not seen in previous Bitcoin cycles or election cycles. And that is the decoupling of Bitcoin from the overall broader market, as well as the decoupling even from gold. I did see this happen just as price change, but again, these could just be some temporary decoupling, and you could see the price of Bitcoin kind of rejoining the pack, if you will, on some of these. So just keep that in mind. The next thing, of course, is going to be future guidance from the company. The price to book ratio that is basically the valuation that investors, institutions, pretty much any of the buyers of the stock put on the company. And some of the ways that it could continue to increase would be if the company did give us some really good forward guidance in terms of how they're going to leverage some of their current operational capital, if there is any form of some acquisitions that could potentially shake up their market share, their global market share of hash rate. So a lot of things could happen. And then we did hear how they're going to be doing the walk, crawl, run aspect of taking advantage of their treasury. They're going to be looking at derivative options. They're going to be looking at, of course, using Bitcoin backing to get a line of credit for them to do other CapEx type moves or just to help a little bit with some of the operations to be able to hold that Bitcoin a little bit longer before having to sell. A lot still to come in terms of that. So I do believe that as the company does continue to provide these monthly updates as well as these quarterly earning reports, we're going to get a really good idea of any other potential multipliers that this price to book ratio could end up changing because of. And then looking at book value, really, I'm just talking about the assets and the liability here. So, a couple things I just talked about a little bit would be additional revenue from the trading desk. So, I think Zach mentioned this on one of the X.com spaces, and he talked about how they do plan on selling some of the Bitcoin, but what they can start to take advantage of is setting up some different derivative activities. So, they could actually do some covered call options on that price of Bitcoin. And if Bitcoin does not hit those specific call option targets or strike prices, then the company gets to keep the premium and then they can still sell the Bitcoin at that current spot pricing. So it's just another way for them to gain a little bit of additional value out of the selling of the Bitcoin. And then, of course, if they're successful at that, they're going to be able to hodl just a little bit more Bitcoin each month based on some of those derivative activities. So again, that's going to have a good impact on the book value there for CleanSpark. And as they continue to increase that treasury amount, it's just going to give them a little bit more leverage to be able to get into more derivatives and more Coinbase line of credit backing. They went from 50 to 200 million. As they continue to show valuation to Coinbase and others, I believe they're going to have even more opportunity in the future to increase that type of credit amount. But taking a look down a little bit further, you can see profit margin improvements. Now, there's many ways the company could get profit margin improvements. Here's just a couple. They could look at reassessing the overall G&A expenses in terms of some of the payroll amounts. And by that, I'm not saying to lay off any other people, but as they continue to increase their hash rate amount, changing over to the immersion miners and adding more units to their fleet, they don't necessarily need to continue stacking the same amount of heads that they have done in the past for their operations. And that's because some of these immersion miners, they're almost self-sustained. They require very minimal amount of maintenance, and a lot of the maintenance can get flagged via telematics, and then you can dispatch those various team members to kind of go over there and help troubleshoot some of these systems. Other ways that they could increase their profit margins could be, of course, negotiating on the price per kilowatt hour that they have with their utility provider. That would definitely have a significant impact on that profit margin. And the more profit margin they're getting, the more opportunity they have to continue stacking that Bitcoin. The next would be share count changes. Now, the company did state that they have no short-term intention just based on what the market is currently valuing the company. It's pretty close to that 1-to-1 on the price to book ratio if you look at their book value. So I do believe that is a smart decision by the company to not basically sell themselves short. If they do believe that they should be at a much higher valuation than where they're currently at, um, it makes sense for them to kind of hold off. And if they have the right tools to be able to pay for operations on a monthly basis, then yeah, there's not really a need for that. However, I do believe that Zach did mention that if there were going to be any shareholder equity activities or shareholder equity draw, if you will, in terms of adding some additional share counts, they're going to be very, very transparent as to what exactly that equity is going to be buying the company and how is it going to be increasing that book value. I think those are very important things as an investor to understand, just as we are investing our dollars into the company then would be investing that equity into growing the company and then providing higher profit margins for the investors and for the business. Moving down the list, asset and liability swings. Again, we talked about acquisitions. If there is a significant acquisition, or maybe the overall company valuation is reassessed and changes, as you do know, the price of these Bitcoin miners, they actually do fluctuate from time to time, just depending on supply and demand aspects, as well as other scenarios. So there could be some appreciation or depreciation in terms of company assets. And then in terms of liability, of course, if there is a very lucrative opportunity, the company could take on some additional liability debt in order to add some additional hash rate to their bottom line. So there's other types of things like assets and liabilities that would also be impacting this book value. And then one last thing would be the market share of global hash rate. So as that continues to increase and the monthly Bitcoin mining could potentially increase as well if they're able to, again, acquire some of these mining businesses at a discount, they could potentially add to their current market share, which would allow them to mine more Bitcoin each month, giving them more revenue, giving them more profit, and then giving them a larger HODL amount to tuck away each month. So, my closing thought is that the company's current fundamentals, as well as their operational strategies that they've shared, are definitely providing a solid growth path for the shareholders. Not sure your thoughts on that. Love to hear your comments as far as how you think the company has been doing. Do you agree with their pivot and their change in strategy? I, for one, definitely do, but love to get your take on that as well. All right, and that about wraps it up for me. Hope you enjoyed this quick update on CleanSpark Inc.'s potential calendar year 2025 forecast. So, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving the video a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and drop some comments. Let me know your thoughts on these models. Do you think I'm way off in terms of Bitcoin pricing? Do you think that the price to book ratio will be changing rather frequently? Love to get your take on all of that. And with all that said, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Keep calm, hash on, and I'll catch you on the next one.